Hello. We now come to the third chapter of Berger's The Heretical Imperative. This is the deductive possibility, reaffirming tradition. Berger's book came out in 1979. Its subtitle is Contemporary Possibilities of Religious Affirmation. So chapter 3 is divided up into 4 bits, and I'll make that into 3 videos, and we'll deal with the first today, the case of Protestant neo-orthodoxy, and then next week move on to 2 of the later sections. Modernization and tradition. In a religious community which has not yet been touched by the relativizing forces of modernization, the tradition has a taken for granted authority. The subjective correlate of this authority is inner certainty. Modernization introduces a corrosive dissonance. The assertion of traditional authority remains, but the individual's inner response becomes discontinuous, hesitant, or uncertain. The authority of the tradition can no longer be taken for granted. For many people in modernized situations, the memory of former assent and certainty remain, often enveloped in a nostalgia for childhood and early youth. Those memories constitute a psychological substratum for any subsequent reaffirmation of the tradition, giving the reaffirmation a subjective plausibility based on individual biography. For example, a student from a Muslim country who spends many years in the West but then returns home to the call of the minaret. The experience is the same for those of any religion and can involve the return of an entire group of people as well as of an individual. Such returns provide a reaffirmation of the tradition and have been called by observers revivalism, nativism, and neo-traditionalism. For example, the powerful mass movement of Islamic resurgence in modern Turkey after many years of Kemalist secularism. The intellectual version of this can be termed neo-orthodoxy, a reaffirmation in theory to complement that in religious and socio-political practice. For anyone, man in the street or intellectual, there is an intrinsic problem to this reaffirmation. The tradition is being affirmed anew, but after an interval in which it wasn't, and it is difficult to forget the existence of that interval. Thus, the particular vehemence of neo-traditionalism. Adherents make a lot of noise so as to drown out that memory. Now let's turn to the case of Protestant neo-orthodoxy, which Berger discusses in terms of 19th century Protestant theological liberalism, the impact of World War I, and then the ideas of Karl Barth. 19th century Protestant theological liberalism. Protestantism has been grappling with the relativizing forces of modernity for longer than any other tradition, so it is paradigmatic for other traditions. 19th century Protestant theology was the age of Schleiermacher. Schleiermacher saw his mission as the defense and reformulation of Christian faith in the face of modern skepticism. Both proponents and critics saw him as the father of theological liberalism. For Berger, Schleiermacher was also the father of the contemporary inductive approach, which he discusses in more detail in a later chapter. That's Schleiermacher's theological enterprise, grounded Christian faith in a more general human phenomenon of religious experience. Christianity was an example of this experience, and for Schleiermacher, the most elevated one. Everything after Schleiermacher was either a development or a refutation of his position. His was a Copernican revolution in theological thinking. In sociological terms, Schleiermacher's turn to religious experience was neither eccentric nor arbitrary, but rather an almost necessary consequence of the modern challenge to traditional authority. Psychologically, The quest for certainty, based on subjective insight, is the result of the frustration of this quest by what is socially available as objective reality definitions. Some of these Protestant theologians displayed high intellectual integrity, especially in biblical scholarship, as, for example, Julius Wellhausen, who inaugurated modern historical scholarship of the Pentateuch, that's the first 5 books of the Bible. After teaching theology at the University of Greifswald for many years, he found that his scholarship made it increasingly difficult for him to prepare students for the Protestant missionary. He had a crisis of conscience. He asked to be transferred to the philosophy faculty, but was refused, so he went to another university instead. But other scholars who experienced a crisis of faith stayed at their posts, trying to reconcile their faith with their intellect, thereby also influencing their students. Though some Catholics and others followed suit, the Protestants are the first example in which committed teachers of a religion turned the full arsenal of critical scholarship on their own religion, whatever the consequences. Now we turn to the impact of World War I. In Protestant theology, or German Protestant theology at least, the 19th century ended in 1918 rather than 1900. World War I was the shock that ended their world. Modernity had had terrible consequences and perhaps had been an illusion. 19th century liberal theology had been optimistic, progressively minded, and favorable in its attitude towards the modern world. The same was true of other areas of thought. It was the triumph of bourgeois civilization which seemed to have secured ongoing improvement for Europe and the rest of the world. There had been a few dissenters from bourgeois triumphalism, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, and so on, but these men only came into their own after the era they had protested against had ended. In the 19th century, they had remained marginal to the cultural and intellectual scene. Theological liberalism derived much of its plausibility from the safe bourgeois world that was its social context. Perhaps the critical Bible scholars could be so daringly radical intellectually because their social world was so safe. The safety of that world was destroyed by World War I, which represented, for some, the collective suicide of European civilization, and its impact was immediately visible, stark and frightening, as were its moral and intellectual consequences. Unsurprisingly, the impact was most obvious in Central Europe, where German culture was now linked to a nation that had been catastrophically defeated in the war. What the Americans came to call neo-orthodoxy emerged in the German-speaking zone almost immediately after the war, but on Germany's borders rather than Germany itself, perhaps significant. The towering figure of this new age was the Swiss theologian Karl Barth. The age of Schleiermacher gave way to the age of Barth and continued until shortly after World War II. Barth's theology was a violent refutation of the preceding period, theoretically, practically, and emotionally. At its core, a thunderous rejection of all the assumptions and achievements of Protestant theological liberalism. It was announced in a single book, Barth's commentary on Paul's epistle to the Romans, which first came out in 1918 according to Berger, but 1919 according to Google, republished in greatly revised form in 1921. An immediate storm of controversy erupted. Barth said he had been like a man stumbling up the steps inside the church steeple in the dark, who had reached out for support, but grabbed the bell rope, causing a mighty boom. Barth's call soon became a movement. In the German-speaking countries, Barth's approach was called Dialectical Theology. A new journal was started, which, if you'll forgive me, I'm not going to say in German, because my German is awful, which in English translates as Between the Times. Neo-Orthodoxy came to be seen as an ideology of resistance. When Barth accepted a university post in Germany, the center of the movement moved there with him. And this was very important with the rise of the Nazis in the 1930s. In 1914, at the start of the war, a group including most liberal German theologians had signed the Manifesto of the Intellectuals, enthusiastically endorsing the German war effort. For Barth, this event decisively shook his confidence in his erstwhile teachers and led him to think radically in new ways. So, in 1934, a group of Protestant theologians and churchmen, many under Barth's influence, issued the Theological Declaration of Barmen, repudiating the then common idea that the Nazi revolution had revelatory import for Christians. For many, this showed that Barthian theology was able to stand up to the pretensions of the modern age. The refusal of neo-orthodoxy to accommodate with the secular world became more plausible, and Barthianism began to attract more people because of its anti-Nazi stance. Other forms of neo-orthodoxy, for example in Lutheranism, also became an ideology of resistance. The decline of neo-orthodoxy after World War II had much to do with the fading of this anti-Nazi aura. So many thanks for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons, Sina Farzel, David Langness, Anthony Lee, Ian Palin, Johannes Rosenbaum, Steve Scholl, Ismail Valesco, Tobias Vetter, Tricia Williams, Jonah Winters, and Gloria Yazdani. You're very welcome to support my channel if you so wish. Please do like, comment, share, subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos, and if you want to offer practical support, I'll give links to Patreon and PayPal below. Next week we'll talk about neo-orthodoxy and its critique. That is, we'll get into the heart of Barth's ideas. Have a good day.